remember the morning exactly. It was Tuesday, April 14th, 2015. A cold front had pushed through overnight, leaving the sky a thin, washed-out blue, and the air with a sharp edge that promised a late frost. I was standing at the edge of the boneyard, that old 10-acre scar my family had carried for 2 generations, and the wind was pulling at the collar of my canvas coat. I remember the date because it was the day Dale Mercer stopped his tractor and laughed at me. He was on his new John Deere, the enclosed cab gleaming, turning over his rich bottomland soil on the other side of our shared fence line. The dirt he was plowing was black and beautiful, the kind of soil that smells like money. The ground on my side of the fence was pale yellow-gray, a mix of shale and compacted clay that the coal company had left behind 50 years ago. He saw me standing there, just staring at it, and throttled down the big diesel engine. The silence that followed felt loud. He slid his window open, leaned out. "Morning, Mary," he called over. "Lose something out there?" I just shook my head, my hands deep in my pockets. "No, Dale, just thinking." He looked at the expanse of waste ground, then back at me, a little smile playing on his lips. He was a good neighbor, not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. "What about?" he asked, humoring me. I took a breath of that cold, clean air. "I'm thinking of putting it to Beets this year. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach." Okay, where were we? Dale stared at me for a long second. Then he let out a short, sharp laugh. It wasn't a mean laugh, more of a surprised, disbelieving bark. He looked from my face to the pale, dead-looking ground and back again. "Beets?" he said, the word itself sounding ridiculous in the quiet morning. "On that, Mary, you might as well try to grow hair on a billiard ball." He shook his head, still smiling, and slid the window shut. The big engine roared back to life, and he went back to his work, leaving me there with his words hanging in the air like exhaust fumes. Hair on a billiard ball. He wasn't wrong, not based on what anyone could see. That piece of land was a lesson in failure. My grandfather had called it the boneyard. It was a spoil pile, the overburden from the strip mine that had taken the top off our ridge back in the 60s. When the company was done, they'd reclaimed it, which was a fancy word for grading the shale and subsoil into a gentle slope and walking away. We got the 10 acres back in 1972, a piece of our own farm returned to us, but broken. It was a ghost. Nothing grew there but poverty grass and a few gnarled scrub pines that looked like they were in constant pain. The soil was so acidic and compacted that rainwater would just sit on top in shallow pools for days before it evaporated, never sinking in. It was a wound on the landscape and a constant quiet shame for my father. He'd spent a whole summer in '78 trying to make it right, dragging a disc harrow over it with his old Ford tractor until the machine nearly gave out. All he did was scratch the surface and burn up a week's worth of diesel. After that, we all just learned to look away. It was the place you didn't go, the part of the farm you didn't count. It was just the boneyard. 10 acres of nothing. The idea hadn't come out of nowhere. It had been sitting on my nightstand for over a year, tucked inside the stiff, leather-bound covers of my granddad Silas's old farm ledger. I'd found it the previous winter while cleaning out the dust and memories from the attic. It was full of his careful, spidery handwriting, detailing crop yields, rainfall, and the price of corn from 1930 to 1955. But in the very back, On pages that were cleaner than the rest, he'd written something different. It was a section titled, "On Mending Broken Ground." He described a piece of land they'd had that was timbered out in the 20s, the soil scraped and compacted by the log skidders until it was much like my boneyard. Everyone else had given up on it. But Silas, he saw something else. He saw a patient, not a corpse. His first entry on the subject started with a line that struck me so hard I had to sit down on the dusty attic floor. He wrote, "The ground don't forget what it was, only what you did to it. You just got to remind it." It wasn't a lament, it was a statement of purpose. What followed wasn't a prayer, but a plan. It was a slow, patient, multi-year strategy. He wrote of using specific plants, not for harvest, but as tools. The first year, he said, was for yellow blossom sweet clover. Its taproot, he claimed, would drive down 4, 5, even 6 feet into the hardest hardpan, creating channels, breaking up the compaction layer by layer. The second year was for a mix of buckwheat and what he called tillage radishes. The buckwheat was a scavenger, pulling up phosphorus that was locked away in the dead soil. The radishes were his bio-drills, thick daikon-style roots that would grow fat and deep in the channels the clover had started. And then you'd just let them rot in place over the winter, leaving behind pockets of organic matter and open pathways for air and water. Only after all that, in the third year, came the amendments. He listed them precisely. Tons of wood ash from the sawmill to raise the pH, crushed rock dust for trace minerals, and all the aged manure you could get. After 3 years of preparation, and only then, he wrote, was the ground ready to be reminded of what it was. For that, he specified a particular root crop, one that would test the depth and health of the new soil. He recommended a variety I'd never heard of, the mammoth long red beet. For a whole year, that ledger sat by my bed. I'd pick it up at night and read his words. It felt impossibly large, impossibly slow. My husband, John, had been gone 3 years by then, and the farm sometimes felt like it was too much for one person. The idea of taking on the boneyard, of pouring time and money into the one piece of ground everyone knew was hopeless, felt like a fool's errand, a private madness. But the thought wouldn't leave me. His words had planted a seed. One evening, I finally picked up the phone and called Eleanor, my oldest friend, who lived in town and had run a nursery for 30 years. I didn't tell her I was thinking of doing it. I just said I'd found an old journal and was curious about something. I read her the passages from Granddad Silas's ledger. I read her his plan for the clover, the buckwheat, the radishes. I braced myself for her to gently tell me I was being sentimental, that old ways were old for a reason. But she didn't. Eleanor was quiet for a long time on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was all business. "Yellow blossom sweet clover," she said, almost to herself. "Yes, that makes sense. It's a biennial. The root structure is incredible. Where would you get that much seed, Mary? 50 pounds at least for 10 acres. Then she asked, "Did he say anything about the starting pH? You'd need to test it. And rock dust. Are you talking about glacial rock dust or granite? It makes a difference. The cost could be significant." She didn't question the wisdom. She questioned the logistics. Her practical, straightforward questions were the opposite of Dale's dismissive laugh. She took the idea seriously, and in doing so, she made it feel real. It stopped being a grandfather's ghost story and became a project, a recipe, a very, very slow recipe. The next morning, I took the first real step. I went to the back of the barn and found my father's old soil auger, a heavy, T-handled screw of steel. I grabbed a half-dozen clean glass jars and a cheap pH testing kit I'd bought from the feed store years ago. I walked out to the center of the boneyard. The poverty grass was sparse and gray, and the ground under it was the color of old, dried bones. I set my feet, put all my weight on the auger, and started to turn. For the first 4 inches, it was just loose, gravelly shale. Then the auger hit the compaction layer. It was like trying to drill into a slate roof. The steel screeched in protest. I had to lean on it, walking in a tight circle, using my whole body to force the tip down. Inch by inch, it bit into the dense, pale clay. When I finally pulled it up from a depth of about a foot, the soil packed in the threads of the screw was horrifying. It wasn't soil. It was a substance, a pale, sickly yellow-gray material, slick and dense like modeling clay, with a faint, sour, metallic smell. There were no roots in it, no sign of life at all. I crumbled some in my hand. It was inert, dead. I put a sample in a jar, marked it with a piece of tape, and moved on. I spent the entire day walking a grid across those 10 acres, a human survey machine. I took a sample every 50 feet, 12 inches deep. Each time, the story was the same. The screech of the auger hitting the hard pan, the same lifeless, pale clay, the same sour smell. By the end of the day, I had 20 samples lined up on the tailgate of my truck. Back in the kitchen, I tested each one for pH. The little paper strips and color charts all told the same tale. The results ranged from 4.1 to 4.4. It was as acidic as vinegar. It was, by any modern agricultural standard, a dead zone, a toxic waste site. But as I stood there looking at those jars, I wasn't discouraged. I was beginning to understand. I had read the patient's chart. I could see the shape of the sickness. I had also noticed things during my long walk. I saw how the south-facing slope, though just as barren, was warmer to the touch. I saw the natural swales where the pitiful rainwater pooled, showing me where the compaction was at its absolute worst. I began to map it in my head, not as a uniform sheet of failure, but as a landscape with its own subtle topography. It wasn't a problem to be solved with a single brutal act of machinery. It was a system that had been broken. Granddad Silas's journal wasn't a trick. It was a systemic therapy. The genius of his method, I realized, was that it used life to fight death. It was a system of tolerances and patience. The sweet clover wasn't just a plant. It was a living plow. Its taproot could generate immense hydraulic pressure, forcing its way into compacted soil where steel could not. It didn't shatter the hard pan. It gently perforated it, creating thousands upon thousands of tiny channels. The buckwheat wasn't just a cover crop. It was a chemical miner, its roots exuding mild acids that could dissolve mineral phosphorus and make it available. And the daikon radishes, which he called tillage radishes, were the masterstroke. They would follow the paths of least resistance, growing down into the channels the clover had made, swelling and expanding them. Then, Instead of harvesting them, you'd let the frost kill them. They would rot in place, a massive injection of organic matter and moisture deep in the soil profile, turning the hardpan into a sponge. The amendments, the ash, the rock dust, the manure, weren't just a dose of fertilizer that would wash away. They were food for the new biome I was trying to build. They were meant to be incorporated into the soil structure that the plants had already started to create. The hard part wasn't the labor. It wasn't the cost. The hard part was the time. It was 3 years of planting crops you would never sell. 3 years of investing in a process that, from the outside, looked like you were just growing weeds. It was an act of faith in a dead man's handwriting. So began the first year of quiet, ordinary work. In late April of 2015, I drove 2 hours to a specialty seed supplier and bought 2 25-pound bags of yellow blossom sweet clover seed. It cost me $185 plus tax. I remember the man at the counter looking at the order. "That's a lot of clover, ma'am. Putting in a big bee pasture?" I just nodded. Something like that. Back home, I couldn't use a tractor and a modern seed drill. The ground was too hard, too uneven. I found my father's old canvas seed bag and the hand-cranked broadcast spreader that went with it. It was a simple tool. You filled the bag, slung it over your shoulder, and as you walked, you turned a crank that spun a disc, flinging the seeds out in a wide arc. For 3 solid days, I walked the boneyard, back and forth, like a sower in an old painting. The tiny yellow seeds looked impossibly small and hopeless against the vast, pale grayness of the ground. I was just throwing them on the surface, trusting the spring rains to do the rest. Dale saw me out there, of course. He'd slow his tractor near the fence line, watching me with a puzzled look. This old woman walking in circles on a dead field, cranking a strange little machine. He never said another word, but I could feel his doubt from 100 yards away. A week later, a soft, soaking rain came and lasted for 2 days. Then the sun came out, and I waited. For 2 weeks, nothing. I thought I'd just fed the birds. Then, one morning, I saw it. A faint, almost imperceptible green haze across the surface of the boneyard. I had to get down on my hands and knees to be sure. Tiny, 2-leafed clover sprouts, pushing their way up between the bits of shale. By July, it was no longer a haze. It was a thigh-high jungle of tough, wiry green stems and small yellow flowers. The air around the field hummed with the sound of bees. The smell was sweet and clean, like honey and rain. It was the first time in my life I had ever smelled anything good coming off that land. I let it stand all summer and into the fall. The frost finally killed it in November, and the green turned to a brittle brown. I left it there, a thick, protective mat over the soil, its work happening silently, deep underground, all winter long. The second year, 2016, was the year of the buckwheat and the radishes. In early spring, I called Dale. "Dale," I said, "I need to ask a favor. Could I borrow your brush hog for a day?" There was a pause. "The boneyard?" he asked. "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "All right," he said. "Key's in it." He didn't ask why. He just left the big mower attached to his smaller utility tractor by the gate. It took me a full day to chop down the dead clover from the year before, turning the brittle stalks into a thick mulch that lay on the surface. The ground underneath was still hard, but it felt different. Less like rock and more like wood. There was a give to it, A week later, I was back at the seed store. This time, I bought 75 pounds of buckwheat and 20 pounds of daikon radish seed. Another $250 gone. And again, I filled the old canvas bag and started walking. The work was the same. The cranking, the walking, the steady rhythm of casting seed on stubborn ground. That summer, the field was transformed again. The buckwheat grew fast and dense, and by July, the entire 10 acres was a rolling sea of delicate white flowers. The hum of the bees was even louder than the year before. You could hear it from the house. Underneath that canopy of white, the big radishes were doing their secret work. In late September, before the first frost, my curiosity got the better of me. I went out with a shovel and picked a spot at random. I dug around one of the radish plants. The top was a modest bunch of greens, but the root was another story. I had to dig down almost 2 feet. When I finally worked it loose and pulled it out, I just stood there holding it. It was as long as my forearm and thicker than a Coke bottle. A perfect white, massive radish. It had driven itself straight down into that dense, acidic clay. A living drill bit. I broke it in half. It was crisp and smelled peppery and clean. I left it lying there on the ground. It was working. I let the frost take the whole field again, the buckwheat and the radishes collapsing into a dark, rotting mass that would feed the soil all winter. 2 years of work, and all I had to show for it was a field of dead plants and one giant radish. But I knew the real work was happening in the dark. Year 3, 2017, was the big one, the year of the amendments. Granddad Silas's instructions were clear. All you can get. I started making calls. I found a small family-run sawmill 2 towns over that had a mountain of wood ash they considered a waste product. They were happy to get rid of it. The owner, a man named George, said if I could haul it, I could have it for free. I spent a week driving my old farm truck back and forth, loading it with a shovel until the suspension groaned. I made 14 trips. I ended up with a pile of fine, gray ash in the corner of the boneyard that was bigger than my truck. It was over 20 tons of the stuff. Next was the rock dust. Eleanor had pointed me to a quarry in Tennessee that sold granite dust as a byproduct of their gravel operation. This wasn't free. I ordered 10 tons, and the shipping was more than the material. A long-haul truck arrived one morning and dumped a massive pile of gritty, gray powder next to the ash. The bill was just shy of $2,000. Finally, the manure. I called a dairy farmer I knew in the next county. He had a whole barn full of manure that had been aged for over 5 years, composted down into a beautiful, black, odorless humus. He sold me 30 tons of it for a price that was more than fair. The cost of hiring the trucks to haul it was another $1,500. By early October, I had 3 enormous piles sitting at the edge of the boneyard. 1 gray, 1 gritty, and 1 black. It was a fortune in dirt. And it was then that I got the official visit. A shiny white county pickup truck pulled into my lane one afternoon. The man who got out was young, maybe 30, wearing a crisp polo shirt with a University Extension logo on it. He introduced himself as Mr. Miller, the new county agent. "Ma'am," he said, looking past me at the piles of material, "we had a call. Someone was concerned about potential runoff." That's a lot of unsecured soil amendment you have there." His tone wasn't accusatory, just bureaucratic. He had a clipboard. I explained what I was doing, that it was part of a long-term reclamation project. I showed him my soil tests from 2 years prior, the ones that read 4.2 pH. He glanced at them and then looked out at the boneyard, at the rotting mat of cover crops. He shook his head slowly. "Ma'am, with all due respect, this land is classified as marginal reclamation. The soil structure is, well, it's non-existent. You put this much nitrogen and alkaline material on it, the first big rain is just going to wash it all into the creek. The ground can't hold it." I tried to explain Granddad Silas's method, the clover, the radishes, the years of preparation. He listened politely, but his eyes were glazed over. "That's an interesting historical approach," he said. "But modern best practices would involve deep ripping with a subsoiler and a significant lime application. And even then, you'd be lucky to establish pasture." He saw it as a problem of chemistry and horsepower. He couldn't see the biology. He made me file a comprehensive nutrient management plan, a thick packet of forms asking for application rates, projected uptake, and erosion control measures. It took me a week, sitting at the kitchen table, trying to fit a 100-year-old organic system into the square boxes of a government form. It was demoralizing. He was the expert, the voice of the institution, and he was telling me I was a fool. He was telling me I was making a mess. One night that November, a deep, soul-level weariness settled over me. The money was spent. The piles of ash and dust and manure sat out there under a cold, hard moon. I had filed the county's paperwork, but Miller's words had found a crack and crept inside. The boneyard didn't look like a field in progress. It looked like I had just made it worse, turning it into a dump site for my own obsessive project. 3 years of work, thousands of dollars. And what if Dale was right? What if Miller was right? What if I was just an old woman playing out a sentimental fantasy, chasing the ghost of her grandfather? The doubt was a physical weight. I went back inside, out of the cold, and poured myself a cup of tea I didn't want. I sat in the quiet kitchen and felt the whole project start to slide away from me. Then I saw the ledger, sitting on the counter where I'd been working on the forms. I picked it up. The leather was worn smooth. I opened it to the back, to his careful, steady handwriting. My eyes fell on the first line I had ever read. "The ground don't forget what it was, only what you did to it. You just got to remind it." I read it again, out loud this time, my voice quiet in the empty house. You just got to remind it. And in that moment, I made a choice. I would not trust the man with the clipboard. I would not trust my neighbor's laughter. I would trust the man who wrote those words. I would trust the clover and the radishes. I would trust the process. I had come this far. I would see it through one more year. The next morning, I rented a manure spreader and spent the next 4 days driving back and forth, laying a thick, even blanket of my 3 amendments over the entire 10 acres. When I was done, the field was black from fence line to fence line. And I left it again to the wind and the rain and the winter snow, to let the last part of the medicine do its work. Spring of 2018 came soft and slow. In mid-April, the time came to see what had been made. I borrowed an old chisel plow from a neighbor on the other side of the valley. one who asked fewer questions than Dale. It wasn't a big, aggressive machine, just a set of curved shanks meant to break up soil without turning it over completely. I hooked it to my father's old tractor, the same one he'd nearly killed trying to disc the boneyard 40 years earlier. I took a deep breath and drove through the gate. I dropped the plow into the ground and eased the throttle forward. I was braced for the screech of steel on hardpan, for the tractor to lurch and strain, but it never came. The shanks sank into the ground, and the tractor moved forward with a steady, low groan. I looked behind me. The plow was pulling up chunks of soil, but this wasn't the pale, dead clay of before. This was soil. It was dark, almost black, and it crumbled as it fell. It looked alive. I stopped the tractor and got off. I knelt and picked up a handful. It was cool and moist and smelled right. It smelled like earth, like a forest floor. It was full of organic matter, the ghost of the clover and the radishes and the manure. And it was full of life. The soil was writhing with earthworms, fat, healthy night crawlers. I hadn't seen an earthworm on that piece of land in my entire life. I stood there for a long time, just holding that handful of dark, living soil. Then I got back on the tractor, and I plowed the whole 10 acres. It took 2 days. The plow sank a good 8 inches, sometimes 10, before it met any real resistance. I had done it. Or rather, we had done it. Me and Granddad Silas. A week later, I took another soil sample from the same spot as my first one 3 years before. In my kitchen, I did the test. The color was a deep, rich chocolate brown. I put the litmus paper in the slurry. It turned a beautiful, healthy shade of green. The pH was 6.8. It was nearly perfect. That afternoon, I sat down and ordered the seeds. 1 pound of mammoth long red beet seed. It was time to remind the ground what it was for. I planted in the second week of May. The soil was so loose and friable, I could have planted it by hand. I used a simple push planter, walking the long, straight rows I had marked out. The work was easy, pleasant. The sun was warm on my back. The field smelled of life and potential. The beet seeds sprouted in less than a week. The summer of 2018 was hot and dry. One of those summers that scorches the grass in your yard to a crisp. But the boneyard, my new field, stayed green. The soil I had spent 3 years building was acting like a giant sponge, holding on to the moisture from the spring rains, nursing the beetroots deep in the ground. The beet tops grew into a thick, lush canopy of green and red that shaded the soil and kept it cool. By early August, you could see the evidence of what was happening underneath. The shoulders of the beets were pushing themselves up out of the earth. They were not small. They were already the size of baseballs, then softballs, a deep, promising red. It was around that time that I got another call from the county. Because I had used so much amendment, they needed to do a follow-up soil certification to close out my nutrient management plan. I said that would be fine. I knew what they would find. The young man who came out this time was not Mr. Miller. His name was Ben Carter, and he was a graduate student from the university, working for the Extension Service for the summer. He was all business, full of a quiet, scientific skepticism. He had a truck full of gleaming equipment that looked like it belonged in a laboratory. He explained he was there to test for nutrient leaching and soil compaction. He expected, he said, to find high concentrations of nitrates at the subsoil level, and for the compaction to be largely unchanged. I just nodded and told him to test wherever he liked. His first tool was something he called a digital penetrometer. It was a long steel rod with a pressure gauge on top. It measured how much force it took to push it into the ground. He chose a spot at random and started to push. He expected it to stop at the old hardpan layer, 8 or 10 inches down. But it didn't stop. It just kept sinking, smoothly and steadily. He pushed it all the way down to its hilt, 24 inches, with minimal pressure. He pulled it out and stared at the hole, then at his gauge. He looked utterly bewildered. "That's not possible," he mumbled. He tried it in another spot, and another. The result was the same every time. The hardpan was gone. He shook his head and went back to his truck, returning with a core sampler. He took half a dozen core samples from across the field, each one a perfect cylinder of earth 2 feet long. The top foot was the black, humus-rich topsoil I had built. The second foot was a lighter brown, threaded with channels of organic matter and riddled with wormholes. It was the healing wound. He took the cores back to his truck. I could see him through the window, running the soil through a portable spectrometer, a machine that analyzed its chemical and structural composition. He was in there for almost an hour. When he finally got out, he walked over to me slowly, holding a printout from his machine. He looked from the paper to the field and back again. "I don't understand this," he said, his professional composure completely gone. "The organic matter content is over 8%. That's prime Midwestern prairie soil. The cation exchange capacity, that's the soil's ability to hold nutrients. It's what you'd expect from land that's been in pasture for 100 years, not a strip mine spoil pile." He pointed to a column of numbers. "And your micronutrient levels, boron, zinc, manganese, they are perfectly balanced. There's no modern protocol, no chemical fertilizer regimen that produces this result, especially not this fast." He looked at me, his eyes full of questions. "What did you do here?" I thought of my grandfather, of the clover and the radishes, of the long years of waiting. "I just followed an old family recipe," I said. He shook his head, a slow look of wonder on his face. "Well," he said quietly, "it works." He went back to his truck and signed the form, certifying the land for unrestricted agricultural use. He had arrived a skeptic and left a witness. Harvest began in the last week of September. The beet tops were starting to yellow, a sign they had put all their energy into the roots. I went out with a sturdy digging fork and a wheelbarrow. I started on the first row, sinking the fork deep into the dark, soft soil.